This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
An insightful perspective on water. Environmental journalist Cynthia Barnett on this edition of Conversations. Cynthia Barnett is an accomplished journalist who has written extensively about water and climate issues, from extreme flooding and droughts to protecting our oceans. Her reporting has appeared in premier publications like National Geographic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic. She is the author of 3 books: Mirage, Florida and the Vanishing Water of the Eastern U.S., Blue Revolution, Unmaking America's water crisis, and her most recent, Rain, A Natural and Cultural History. She is also an environmental journalist in residence at the University of Florida. We welcome Cynthia Barnett to Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be in Pensacola.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here as our guest. Question for you, what was it that drew you to this field of study?
To water, yeah, that's a good question. So I was a general assignment newspaper reporter for many years. And reporting in Florida, it sometimes seems that every story comes back to water. And I was with Florida Trend magazine, the statewide business magazine, for a number of years. I did cover stories on desalination and Everglades restoration and wetlands mitigation banks. And there was a time, I think there was this turning point. There was this time when Florida was in quite an epic drought. You may remember around 2000, I was covering this drought, and specifically developers in Florida had become very worried about water availability. They had to show that there would be enough water available before they could build a new subdivision. And on the side, I was working on a master's degree in environmental history. So this is a field, you recently had Jack Davis on. He's an environmental historian. So the idea of looking at history from the standpoint of the water and land and not just, the wars and the people. And so in my studies, I was learning about Florida's early history, when developers were getting rid of water and getting rid of water and getting rid of water. And then in my day job as a journalist, I was writing about the developers desperate to find water. And that irony that, sort of the same group of people who got rid of it in the first place, now were desperate to find it, became my first book. So, as you said, my first book was Mirage, Florida and the Vanishing Water of the Eastern U.S. And the cliff notes for that book are that we set out to get rid of water and we got rid of too much. So it's all about how water could possibly be vanishing in a state as wet as Florida. So that's how it started. And the first book led to the second, and the second to the third, and so on. Interesting. Talk a little bit about our history as a civilization with water, because like you said, in so many cases we take it for granted. And as I was getting ready for this interview, I thought about it in 2 ways. It's very much a precious resource, but at times it's sometimes an enemy with flooding, etc. Yeah. So especially Florida's water history has been this interesting battle with water, sometimes too much and sometimes not enough. And so I think that frame that water is an enemy to fight, or at least was in the 20th century, that frame turned out to be quite harmful. Seeing water as the enemy meant that we put up all the dikes and barriers, the things we did that ended up really destroying the Everglades, and the other alterations to water and waterways, the mass drainage of wetlands. We drained a total of 12 million acres statewide, not realizing in the beginning of that process how crucial wetlands would be to us for, they're safe houses for water. They keep us safe from hurricanes and other floodwaters because they give water a place to go in a flood, but they're also really important for storage of water. And so, draining the wetlands and these kind of massive alterations that we did ended up hurting us in the long run. So my second book is about the idea of a new water ethic, and I've traveled around the world to report on solutions. That's one thing I learned writing the first book, is that people really are searching for solutions. They want answers. And so I went to various places around Florida, around the country, around the world, to look at places that had really come together, where people had come together to live differently with water. And one of the lessons was definitely that changing ethic and that turn, no longer seeing water as the enemy, but seeing water as something that we work with. And so that's kind of the conversation that's going on in Pensacola now about all the flooding and the need for more green infrastructure and so on. Those are the conversations that are going on around the country and I think around the world.
When we say green infrastructure, what do you mean?
Yeah, so it's kind of a infrastructure is kind of a wonky term, isn't it? The idea of green infrastructure, the better way of putting it, maybe just using nature to our advantage rather than being at war with nature and with water. We use water to our advantage. So this is things like, restoring wetlands. I know there's been a lot of wetland restoration here along the bay and all along the Panhandle. Restoring wetlands, again, to give water a place to go in times of too much and to store water in times of too little. It's a matter of maintaining trees and forest, using forest as a water supply strategy or a flooding, anti-flood strategy, rather than tearing down trees and building more concrete, which can exacerbate flooding. The idea is to use nature to our advantage, which there really isn't a downside to, because you have the aesthetic benefit as well. So again, these are some of the interesting conversations happening around the country.
Does it seem to you that we're seeing more extreme weather events today than perhaps we have in recent years?
Yeah, so we know this. Meteorologists say that we're seeing more extreme rains now than we have in the past 100 years. So if you look at a chart, the extreme rains are sort of growing over the century. And this is an impact of climate change. So in general, as the world warms, the dry places are getting drier and the wet places are getting wetter. And the other interesting thing about extreme rains, if your audience is interested, there was an interesting graphic in the 4th National Climate Assessment that came out in November. So the federal government puts out a climate assessment, and you can kind of go in there and search for your own state or your own community. And it's online, it's pretty easy to find. And if you look there, you can see that, there are parts of the United States that are seeing more extremes than other places. And Pensacola and Mobile, this region is seeing more intensity of rains. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't think climate scientists, have that granular level of detail of why rains are changing in specific places the way they are. But they do see a general trend of more extremes. And this happens to be one of the places in the United States that is seeing more extremes. And it could be just because you're a rainy place anyway, right? So when I wrote my third book, which is literally the Book of Rain, I wrote the history of rain, a cultural and natural history of rain. When I wrote that book, I looked at the rainiest places in the United States, and Mobile was the rainiest place in the United States.
Really?
Yeah, it gets more rainfall than any other major metro area. I think number 2 was West Palm Beach. So it could be that because it's already rainy here, like I said, the rainy places are getting rainier. the dry places are getting drier. So these are all the more reasons to have conversations about how we can live more ethically with water.
Right.
And we can, and it's happening. You know, it's happening here and it's happening all over the world.
When you say live more ethically with water, what do you mean?
Yeah, so in the second book, Blue Revolution, the idea behind that book, it really articulates a water ethic for the United States. And the way I came to that conclusion is that in all the solutions you can look into or write about or measure success by, you know, there's technology, there's, you know, some people turn to the courts and fight over these things, or water management, engineering, there are all these different pieces of solutions. But what mattered more than anything else in some of the places I wrote about, which included Australia and the Netherlands and Singapore, places that have really come to live differently with water, the thing they all had in common was that people had really come to live more ethically with water. So the simple definition, and I've come up with a definition, is that we use less and we pollute less. I mean, those are kind of the basic things that we can do, that we're already doing, and this is happening around the country. We use less and we pollute less, and we live with water today in the way that doesn't jeopardize water for future generations. That's the simple definition.
Are we doing a better job today as far as keeping our water clean?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I like about the story of water is that there are these inspirational success stories you can look at and show people how we can live differently. So as you mentioned, I teach at the University of Florida, and sometimes at the beginning of the semester, the students are very depressed about the environment. They come in, they've learned about climate change, they feel a bit hopeless about what's happening to water, you know, extinction of species, all these things that we know are happening to the earth. And I like to tell them some of the bad ideas in the past that never happened, to kind of show them what can change. So, for example, many of them don't know that we nearly dammed the Grand Canyon. They've been to the Grand Canyon and they don't realize, you know, they didn't live through the American age of dams,
Right.
so they don't remember that fight, or, you know, how we brought that age to an end. So, you know, I talked to them about the industrial pollution in the Northeast. Right. In the early part of the 20th century. Rivers like the Cuyahoga regularly caught fire, and people just accepted industrial pollution as the price we pay for economic prosperity. Now we know it didn't have to be that way, right? So there was this turning point when people stopped accepting industrial pollution and they said, no, we don't want to live like this. And that was a turning point that really saw the great water laws and the pollution laws of the early 70s. So at the federal level, we passed the Clean Water Act. We created the Environmental Protection Agency. Here in Florida, 1972 was the year we created the water management districts. So the cleanup in that time has been remarkable. Escambia Bay was one of the most polluted bays in the entire United States. I think you still hold the record for fish kills. That was right around that time. Worst fish kills in the country. You would not go kayaking in Escambia Bay back then, right? Sewage running directly into the bay. And now it's kind of the sparkling centerpiece of the community that it should be. And that is a really important turnaround story for young people to hear, that we have done big things before and we've cleaned up pollution in the past, and the problems we face now are not intractable. I think that's really important for people to know.
In your judgment, what are the biggest problems that we currently face, the biggest challenges?
Yeah, so the big challenges, I think, are three. we use too much, we pollute water, and we are altering natural waters in such an extreme way that it's really coming back to hurt not only our ecosystems, but ourselves. So those are kind of the three things to focus on: water use, water quality, and then alteration of natural systems. And in all three of those areas, like I said, people are changing. And even water use, for example, when I wrote my first book, Mirage, I think Floridians used about 174 gallons of water per person a day, and it's been slowly going down. In the past 15 years, it's dropped. I think it's about 130 now. So that's still a lot. That's still a very high per capita water use, especially when you think of other parts of the world. I think Australia is down to about 40 gallons per person, and that is, a beautiful and well-developed part of the world. But they're very ethical in the way they use water. And so water use is big. Pollution is still a very big deal. As you know here, you still have pollution problems here, as we do around Florida. In South Florida, the blue-green algae was a terrible crisis. Last summer, that was reported in the world news, and so these are things that are still out there to work on. But we're getting better. We're getting better at using less. We're getting better at putting less pollution out into the world. We're learning more about green infrastructure, and cities are really working on that. Yeah.
We have put together some slides, and I want to put those slides up.
Sure.
And I'm going to have you kind of go through and talk about the various situations.
Yes.
And some of the slides will show some things that had actually happened because of flooding and et cetera. So if James wants to go ahead and put those up. And we'll start with our new governor, Governor Ron DeSantis. And you have, I understand, spoken with him a fair amount and kind of understand his thoughts on the environment.
Well, I actually met with him a week ago. He came to the University of Florida to talk to different people specifically about water issues. And so Governor DeSantis has gotten off to a very strong start on water. He campaigned, because the blue-green algae had been such an incredible crisis, he campaigned on fixing the blue-green algae crisis and the problems in the Everglades. That's a huge problem to fix, but he within 2 days of his inauguration, he signed one of the farthest reaching water orders in state history. So he called for a record $2.5 billion in Everglades restoration, a harmful algae task force, and these harmful algae are showing up all over the world, and a chief science officer, which is a really big change compared to the previous administration. So he's appointed a chief science officer to kind of shepherd through some of these ideas and advise him on science. So that has been a big switch, and I think welcome, because Governor DeSantis has an ability to really maybe depoliticize some of these issues, including climate change. It's a shame that climate change has become such a political issue, and really all the impacts of climate change are being felt through water. So these extreme rains that you're seeing in Pensacola, or the severity of hurricanes, and like I said, when drought comes, there are more extreme droughts. So sea level rise, all these things are kind of being felt through water. So water is a way that I think Governor DeSantis and other Republican governors around the country are working on climate change.
Why do you think that the discussion of climate change has become such a political hot potato, if you will?
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon, because 12 and 15 years ago, Republican governors and Republican presidents, both George Bush's, worked on climate change. This was a bipartisan issue. Part of it is a pretty intentional campaign by the fossil fuel industry to politicize it, to plant doubt that climate change is real. And that is a shame, because it's just science. It's not a belief. It's not something you believe in or not. It's just a matter of science and kind of what they're figuring out about what's happening to the atmosphere over time. And the cause is carbon dioxide emissions. So, you know, it's really been hurtful, I think, to see the politicization of climate change. And again, if we can work on water, if we can work on resilience, if we can work on climate change in those tangible ways, especially as people see, you know, they're seeing more extreme rains, they're seeing wildfires, worsening wildfires in California. I think as those things happen, people become open to wanting to work on problems in their own community. And so hopefully that will be our way out of this strange political place we've gotten to.
So the counter argument on that would be that you hear oftentimes is, well, it's just a cyclical thing that's going on in the environment, and we can go back in history and find, you know, various other times that, you know, the data perhaps was like it is today. So your response to that.
Right. So, and yes, and in my rain book, I went all the way back in human history to write the story of rain. And we've had, certainly we also had mega droughts 4,000 years ago. Humanity lived through a mega drought, and you know, we got down to incredibly small numbers, but people were very resilient and came back from that and sort of came together. And so I wish I had a graphic about this, but what you can see so you're right, we have these changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we've never had a spike like this without a natural event, without a huge natural event such as a big volcanic eruption. This spike in carbon emissions tracks exactly along with the Industrial Revolution. So when you look at, emissions, it's just like an exact track with the changing of the climate and with warming. So it's really not uncertain science. Again, scientists are, in agreement on carbon dioxide and the human causes of climate change. And I think again, the more important thing is maybe helping people come together to work on resilience now in their own communities, and to be able to see, what can we do to mitigate for sea level rise in Pensacola or wherever you live. So we have these levels of need. At the community level, we need to come together to make our coastlines more resilient. And then there's this national level where we can, again, it kind of goes back to using less and living better. If we use less water, if we put less pollution out into the world, if we use less energy, thereby creating less carbon dioxide emissions, it's not as if we're going to live worse, right? We're making the world better. So it's like that cartoon. There's a cartoon that says something like, what if we fixed the world and climate change wasn't real? Yeah. It's kind of funny.
Let me throw up a couple of more photographs. We're getting short on time here. I have about 4 minutes, but I'll get James to hopefully pop that up. What is this one?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. We think of water depletion as a phenomenon of the arid Southwest, right? But this is a satellite image from a NASA program called GRACE that will take a snapshot of groundwater depletion in aquifers. So this looks at depletion in aquifers over about the past 50 years. And you can see that Florida has some extreme aquifer depletion. So it just goes to show the importance of, pumping less groundwater and living more ethically with water.
See what our next slide here, and we'll take a look and get you to comment. Yeah. Up around Atlanta, Lake Lanier.
Yeah, so this is Lake Lanier, and your audience may remember, I think it was around this time in 2007, when Lake Lanier came within days of going dry, and that's the water supply for the entire metro area of Atlanta. The important thing here, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama have been fighting over the Lake Lanier water that goes into it's Chattahoochee River water that then runs into the Apalachicola and Apalachicola Bay. These three states have been fighting over that water for 30 years instead of working together to use less. So we're in these lawsuits. Taxpayers have paid tens of millions of dollars to the lawyers to fight about it in court. But the better way of living that, again, people are getting to elsewhere in the country is to kind of come together to use less rather than fight these battles in court all the time. Yeah.
We have about 2 minutes left in the program here. So a couple things. I understand you're working on another book?
I am working on another book, yes. I don't know if I can describe it in 2 minutes.
Okay.
I am working on a book of seashells.
Okay.
So I started with freshwater. I'm kind of completing the hydrologic cycle here. I wrote about freshwater and then rain, and now I'm turning to the ocean. So the idea is to write this, it's sort of an epic story of humanity and seashells. And it's a metaphor for our relationship with the sea. So we've always loved seashells for the beautiful exterior rather than the life inside. In the same way we've loved the ocean as the beautiful backdrop of life rather than the source of life. So it's got these great human stories of shells, but it does lead to climate change. So some of the smallest shells are beginning to dissolve in the acidifying sea. And the idea is that this is such a beloved part of nature. Everyone loves seashells, and that by telling the story of seashells, I hope to draw a new audience to these environmental stories that are so important to our world.
A fascinating conversation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much
your
for
time.
having me. It was a pleasure.
You bet.
Thanks.
Cynthia Barnett. And by the way, you can find her online at cynthiabarnett.net. And I believe she is also on Twitter at Cynthia Barnett.
That's right.
All right, I got it. You can see more of our conversations online at WSRE.org/conversations. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take wonderful care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.